This is Vision 7. And let's position ourselves geometrically. Each of our lecture series, each quarter, has 12 lectures. So that if you divide 12 at the midpoint, always lectures 6 and 7 will be bookends, parentheses, around the center. And so lecture 6 in any given series, any given quarter, will always have a summation kind of a quality, and lecture 7 will always have a kind of a springboard kind of a quality. So lecture 6 gets you up to the board, and lecture 7 gets you to dive. And in Vision, because this is the first dive in a whole differential cycle, I'd like to make clear today that your minds are ready. Most of you have gone through the first year one way or another, listened to tapes, or been here. Your minds are ready for a demonstration. And this demonstration actually is very much what in ancient times, in fact, older than ancient, in archaic times, was called magic. In other words, the mental space of consciousness was in archaic times considered a supernatural realm. The mind was considered a supernatural realm. Most life was lived in terms of the landscape, the game, the crops even, but even before domestication of plants. The Neolithic Revolution is not that old. The first domestication of crops on the planet was only about 12,000, 13,000 years ago. Before that, nobody grew crops anywhere on the planet. And there were a couple of places like the mountains in between Iran and Iraq, places in Thailand, places in the Mideast, along the Jordan River, were the first places in the world that domesticated crops and grew crops. It's about 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 BC. In fact, Jericho is the oldest city in the world that's still extant because it was a collection, harvesting, and distribution center for grain. And that's why Jericho, alongside the Jordan River, has such a deep archetypal quality. And actually the ford of the Jordan River from Jericho going east, that ford in the Jordan River is the oldest transition spot in the world for the distribution of man-grown nutrition. Which is why when John the Baptist and Jesus were looking for the most archetypal place to show a new kind of inner nutrition for a new kind of world, that's where they chose to baptize, was in the ford of the Jordan River, exactly there. So that if one understands time, human time, in a very measured kind of a way, the meaning begins to emerge in huge clouds, huge fertile clouds of intuition and insight. And this enormity of the clouds coming and the lightning coming out of the clouds is intuition. Later on, in esoteric Western lore, in the Renaissance, became codified in a certain emblem, an emblem that was indicative of the civilized version of this archetype of lightning coming from the thunderheads. And in Renaissance emblematic symbolism, you will find clouds and a hand coming out of the clouds, sometimes pointing, sometimes giving something, a book, a sword, or something, And even in old tarot decks, you will find the aces still have that kind of emblematic imagery from the Renaissance, because tarot decks come from the Renaissance. That's the first time there were tarot decks. First time that symbolism was brought into a visionary whole. But it goes back into archetypal time, archetypal dimensions. Now, what's interesting for us is how there are very interesting indications of fractures. Once one knows cycles and patterns, and you can read them, there are certain discontinuities which look to the mind, to the eye, to the vision of someone who knows how to read strata, that some catastrophic event happened because the discontinuities are so great that, for instance, some central symbol which had for 1,000 years meant one thing, all of a sudden means something completely opposite. You understand then that in between the two examples, the last example of it being still whole, and the first indication of something completely different, that something has happened to the mind, to human beings, to that mental space, to the supernatural. Something has happened there. And one comes to understand, if you're a doctor of civilization, you have to know this. You have to know how to diagnose this as well as cure it. You have to be able to diagnose what it was. What is the disease? What is the illness that produces this? And so you have to learn all kinds of qualities of symbols and archetypes and cures, just like a doctor would have to learn all about the human body and all about pharmacology and all about the practicality, and sometimes in more recent centuries have to learn about surgery and various other kinds of qualities. One of the symbols that I'm going to mention today concerns a fabulous character who actually did live. And the fabulous character who actually did live was King Solomon. Now, in our own time, in our town, in Hollywood, they've made several versions of King Solomon's Mines. Here's the first old one with Paul Robeson, Sir Cedric Hardwicke before he was a Sir. Here's the one with Stuart Granger and Deborah Kerr. I didn't bring the third one, Richard Chamberlain. It's not a very good version. King Solomon's Mines. Well, what is it about King Solomon's Mines? Well, King Solomon's Mines is a secret place hidden away that's a mine of jewels, especially diamonds. And so King Solomon is remembered mythically in this town in Hollywood as some king who at one time had fabulous jewel mine, especially diamond mine. Well, jewels are symbols of scintillating value, of eternal value. Diamonds are forever. That kind of quality. Solomon is remembered as having been wise, and that his jewels were jewels of wisdom. And the wisdom of Solomon is proverbial, absolutely proverbial. And in ancient times, the wisdom of King Solomon was sort of the standard by which a lot of people measured the widest comprehension of man. And yet, when we look at something like the collection of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic materials, one of the books in the Nag Hammadi collection, buried in Egypt around 350 AD, one of the books in that collection is called The Apocalypse of Adam. And in fact, there are studies on the Apocalypse of Adam from the Nag Hammadi material. And there are whole translations and commentaries on the Apocalypse of Adam, expensive esoteric books. But it's the way in which Solomon is looked at in the Apocalypse of Adam that is revelatory. It's astounding. Here it reads, "He came from a virgin. Solomon sought her, and Saul and his armies, which had been sent out. Solomon himself sent his army of demons to seek out the virgin. And they did not find the one whom they sought, but the virgin who was given to them. It was she whom they fetched. Solomon took her. The virgin became pregnant and gave birth to the child there. She nourished him on a border of the desert. When he had been nourished, he received glory and power from the seed which he had been begotten. Thus he came to the water." In the Gnostic vision, buried in 350 AD, but written much earlier, written probably a couple hundred years before, written probably in the 2nd century, the middle of the 2nd century, around 150 AD, written about that time. Around 150 AD, Solomon is symbolized by somebody who rapes a virgin, and the bastard son of this comes from the edge of the desert into tremendous power and camps out beside the water. The water is always a symbol of consciousness or unconsciousness, of the mental space. So that there is some kind of connection between a savior, illegitimate son of a virgin, fathered by a rape of King Solomon. This is very strange. So about 150 AD, this was actually current. And current widely enough in the world to be the symbolic image, the visionary image of Solomon at that time. Now this is even more extraordinary because only 100 years before, around the middle of the 1st century AD, around 50 AD, King Solomon's visionary image was of the highest purity imaginable. Some of the books that have come down from that time, one of them that was even admitted into the New Testament for a while, is called the Odes to Solomon. Some of the finest quality mystical poems on earth. Here's number 13 of the Odes of Solomon, just a short one, just to give you a kind of a sample of the pristine, penetrating, high, clear wisdom. "Behold, the Lord is our mirror. Open your eyes and see them in him, and learn the manner of your face. Then announce praises to his spirit, and wipe the paint from your face, and love his holiness, and put it on. Then you will be unblemished at all times with him. Hallelujah." So, from 50 to 150 AD, only 100 years, only 3 generations, some catastrophic thing happened to the human psyche. Absolutely catastrophic. What happened between 50 and 150 AD? And you can even narrow it down because the beginnings of the kind of vision that the Nag Hammadi material had, the Gnostic vision, the first time that you see something of this is about a generation before then, about 125, 130 AD. Several great Gnostic teachers all of a sudden convert from traditional underground Christian priests into flamboyant, cosmopolitan gurus. Valentinus in Alexandria, Marcion in Rome. All of a sudden, you have figures who are apocalyptically hypnotic in their messages. Marcion had more people in his church than any other church or religious cult in Rome, even though Christianity was officially proscribed and forbidden. Valentinus was the most charismatic teacher in Alexandria of that generation, perhaps of that whole 2nd century. And Solomon's wisdom holds all the way through till about 90 AD. Because one finds in the little short Hermetic treatise that we started Vision with, the Mind Shepherd, the Poimandres, one still finds the good shepherd of the supernatural mental space still intact, still capable of handling things. So something between 90 and 125 AD happened. Something that was apocalyptic and catastrophic. The best history that we have of that time period is from a Roman historian named Tacitus. And Tacitus was an extremely brilliant man, very wealthy. In fact, he climbed almost to the pinnacle of Roman power. He was a Roman consul. Every year, the Roman Empire had 2 consuls, 2 military leaders that shared power over the military for a year in the empire, and Tacitus was consul. He married the daughter of a man named Agricola, who was the governor of Britain. So he was very high up, and Tacitus's histories show us that beginning about the middle of the 40s AD, that the Roman mind began to suffer bludgeoning and brutality on a very deep level. It actually began almost like a trigger with the death of Tiberius Caesar, the chosen adopted son of Augustus Caesar. And Tiberius Caesar died in 36 AD, which incidentally is the year of the death of Jesus also. And beginning about 36 AD, there was an uneasiness on the deepest levels of the mind in Rome that something diseased had come into the Caesar line. And the very next Caesar, after about 3 years of rule, literally took a mental nosedive and became almost, as we would say today, clinically insane. His name was Caligula. Absolutely vicious. And the next Caesar was somebody who was chosen because he would stay out of the power game, Claudius, and would remain on the side and had a speech impediment and couldn't quite, and maybe you're familiar with the Robert Graves' I, Claudius TV series. And it seemed that for a little while that Roman archetypal power was safe because somebody had learned not to use it, but the very next Caesar was Nero. And Nero was so much more terrifying than Caligula. Caligula, who was given to ranting temper tantrums and moments of insanity, who picked upon the Jews in Alexandria to vent his scapegoat blame. The first time that there was ever anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire under Caligula. The Jews in Alexandria are the cause of this. Whereas when Nero comes in, he expands this and he says, all of the sects that have risen out of Judaism and not in Alexandria but in Rome are to blame. It's the Christians, so-called, in Rome that are to blame. And it's like a transposition from the Jews of Alexandria to the Christians of Rome. And in fact, the Hollywood popular image is of Christians being fed to the lions in gladiatorial contests in the Colosseum under Nero. And where Caligula was satisfied to simply destroy the home life of the Jews in Alexandria, they lost all of their property. They were herded into the hippodrome in Alexandria and threatened with mortal death en masse, just like a Nazi concentration camp, about 40 AD, 41 AD. They were saved from this by a venerable old philosopher named Philo, who went to Rome with a deputation and personally stood up to the madness of Caligula and deflected the anger, so they were just dispossessed of their property and left to live. But the very same rut of terror was followed by Nero against the Christians in Rome, because he saw, well, these are the people that have the real power underneath everything, and they're a threat to me. And in his vivid, psychotic imagination, Nero saw that Rome had become contaminated, had become infested with another kind of psychic power underground, the Christian, Jewish Christian power, psychic power underground. And that's why he burnt the entire city to the ground. The Rome of Nero's day had about 2.5 million people. He burnt the entire city to the ground to build a new Rome, one that would be not contaminated, based upon the true, pure Caesar power line. Our power, not theirs. There'll be no underground. It'll be from the ground up our power. Roman Empire, Roman imperial power. And the Caesar line ended with Nero, because the rebuilding of a city the size of Rome, rebuilding the eternal city, as it were, was such an enormous undertaking that a whole new line was brought in, a whole new visionary line, because in 1 year, 4 different men tried to be Roman emperor, and each one of them died, except the 4th. Within 1 year, it's like every 3 months, a new imperial Caesar. The 4th man was named Vespasian, and he was not a Caesar. He was a Flavian of a whole different family. They call it in Latin gens, a whole different family line. And he said that the contamination was in the psyche of the Caesars. That's where the contamination was. And to build a new Rome, you had to have a new vision. And a new vision meant that you had to have a new messianic figure to stand at the center of that new vision. And that it was proved when Vespasian was in Alexandria that he was the Messiah of the new age. He was the one to build the new Rome. He and his 2 sons. His older son was named Titus, and his younger son was named Domitian. And Vespasian said to his older son, we want to make sure that we don't have any of the jeopardy from the time of Caligula or the time of Nero. We don't want to have that happen again. So whether they're Jews in Alexandria or whether they're Christians in Rome, the true occult root of their power is in Jerusalem. It isn't in Rome. It isn't in Alexandria. It's in Jerusalem. That's their city. And the one building in Jerusalem that is the place where the knot of all their occult power is the temple in Jerusalem. And so he gave permission to his son Titus to completely lay siege. We're not going to just proscribe Jews' property in Alexandria. We're not just going to burn the city of Rome down. We're going to go and burn their city down. And that Jerusalem will be completely destroyed, and especially the temple will be desecrated and then destroyed. So, within 3 movements in history, separated only by few years each time, you have Caligula against the Jews in Alexandria, Nero against the Christians in Rome, and then Vespasian and Titus and Domitian against the Jews in Jerusalem. So you have Alexandria, Rome, and Jerusalem, all in the 1st century AD. Now these are catastrophic events. These are absolutely catastrophic events. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 69 AD is considered archetypally one of the great turning points of the world. The burning of Rome by Nero is considered one of the great turning points of the world. The madness of Caligula against Alexandria is considered one of the great turning points of the world, all within just a few years of each other. But notice that the effect, the breaking of the mind, did not happen until around 110 AD, 115 AD, somewhere around then. So that as catastrophic as the Alexandria episode was, as catastrophic as the Rome, as catastrophic as the Jerusalem, something even more catastrophic happened around 115 AD. So catastrophic that its size was almost unseeable except by the human psyche and by someone of the level of Tacitus. And what happened? Tacitus says the worst thing in the world happened. Not the desecration of other peoples, of other religions, but the revival of Roman imperial power to a new zenith. Not that something else was broken, but that Roman power was put back together again stronger than ever. And the man who put it together stronger than ever was named Trajan. And there's still today. In Rome, one of the few things that has survived has never been pulled down is Trajan's column. It's still there. And Trajan raised Roman power to the height, the apex. Roman power was never greater than in the time of Trajan. There were Roman garrisons in Ireland and in Vietnam. That's the spread of Roman power under Trajan. The Roman Empire had more provinces under absolute military control around 115 AD. And Trajan was extremely interesting because he almost never went to Rome. He had the city rebuilt so that the classic Hollywood version of Rome is really Trajan's Rome. He rebuilt all the buildings the way they should be, with outsized columns and power. We're not talking about Greek stuff. We're talking about Roman power. We want entrance porticos that 150 feet high just to enter into the building. We want to have buildings that are so enormous. Well, it worked. The ruins of some Roman buildings during the Middle Ages were considered natural things, like maybe you've seen in Utah or Virginia, natural bridges of rocks. There were masonry arches in the Middle Ages left over from the ruins, building like the Baths of Caracalla, which was probably as large as the Astrodome in Houston. And its ruined arches, overgrown with weeds, were considered to be natural formations of the landscape, mountains, and not at all buildings. And the first people to recognize that these were geometric shapes of buildings were architects in the 1200s like Giotto, who came to realize that at one time human beings understood the art of building so well that they could build arches that were taller than imagination at that time could make them. It would be as if we in our time discovered that there were once 3-mile-high buildings somewhere in the Gobi Desert. It's a quality which Tacitus points out that the most horrifying thing of all to the psyche is that this torrential mad power has regained itself and is stronger than ever. The reinstatement of the Roman imperial power around 115 AD broke the subconscious psyche of man in the Western world. And when it breaks, when something like that breaks, appropriately, I have a broken book here. Wisdom and Cult. It's about the wisdom literature and regressive cult. When it breaks, when something like that breaks, when it snaps, it tends not to stay apart, but to come back together, upside down. And one of the symbols that came together upside down was King Solomon. Instead of King Solomon being a wise king who had jewels of wisdom, who honored women. I mean, Solomon is always considered one of the great romantic lovers in history because of his deep appreciation of women. On the other side of it is Solomon, who rapes a sacred virgin and creates a savior out of bastard, upside-down conditions. The human psyche breaks not under stress, because the human psyche is made to take stress, to distribute stress. It breaks when power is reinstated stronger than ever. Because it's like a kind of a movement. It's like an earthquake type of movement that shatters its particular kind of structure. The human psyche, under suffering, under stress, will transform. One of the materials out of Jung's alchemical study, the vision of Zosimus, is the archetypal alchemical transformation that happens when unendurable stress is put upon a spiritual pattern. It will transform. And in its transformation, it will differentially project out and transform the intolerable conditions into a new world. In other words, the human psyche under stress, even catastrophic stress, will transform and then break the world. and reformed the world. And the world reformed, Jung uses the term in antiodromia. When the world is reformed, it's like the saying, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It's that kind of thing. The world breaks and the world is remade. But under a very special condition where a tyrannical imperium power, which has gotten a hold of archetypal energy, is reinstated stronger than ever, the world doesn't break and change. The psyche breaks and changes. And what happens is an enantiodromia. That happened in this world in the 1960s. Things that before were beautiful and whole and life-giving for 1,000 years now are held in complete disregard. What was traditional and loving and normal now is a sucker's kind of sappiness. We're living in that kind of a situation, not because catastrophic things are happening here. They've already happened. We've been through everything in the 20th century. But the most catastrophic thing is reinstating a tyrannical authoritarian power structure worldwide, back stronger than ever, so as not only not challenged, but is unchallengeable, supposedly. That's the kind of motion and energy that fractures the psyche. Instead of the world changing, the psyche changes, and it changes in just this way. So that if we look at images that were traditionally life-giving, traditionally fulfilling for people, and we look at those images, they hold all the way through into the 1960s. They no longer hold. They didn't hold in the 1980s even. They even didn't hold in the 1970s already, one can see. Now, it's a peculiar thing. One cannot see this kind of dimension of threat, of peril, without vision. Hence one of the most quoted phrases, I think, in the world. Without vision, the people perish. And you can write it in any language that you want to. It holds. Without vision, the people perish. There's no way that they can survive. Now, what is interesting to us here in the 7th Vision lecture, we're beginning to get some idea that we're living in a whirlwind. We're caught up already. There isn't anything that we can do, there isn't anywhere that we can go that isn't already subject to that kind of carnival swirling motion. It's already there. It's been there for almost a generation. But what this education does is it shows that classically there still is not only a way out individually and a way out collectively, but a way to unplug the undesirable situation, to take away its power so it doesn't work anymore. And it's almost like a whirlwind cut off from its contact with the ground. Once it's made contact with the ground, it has to maintain contact with the ground. Otherwise, it loses its power. One of the great little stories, I just tell you, I gave in a lecture at the Philosophic Research Society. I was talking about the ancient power of American Indian medicine men. This was before conditions changed so much that if a supposedly white person talks about American Indian visionary things, he's sued by every American Indian, even if they only have 1% blood. There are very few of them have sat in deep meditation with tribal council like me. Very few of them ever were really deep tribal members like myself and my daughter, and really understood what this was. In that lecture, I talked about Hosteen Kla, who was the greatest of all of the Navajo medicine men, who came to visit Manly Hall in the 1930s and left 36 hand-drawn, visionary, just used crayons on cardboard. But he left this as a visionary testimony, almost like the visions of Zosimus in ancient times, of how a transition of suffering happens so that the world will change. And one of the keys is that one has to take the suffering back in a personal way. Even though the world has become powered up and the psyche has broken, if the psyche takes the suffering back in upon itself all over again, it's like large-scale civilized karate. You can break an imperial planetary power. One person can do that if they do it right. It's the whole principle of Gandhi's Satyagraha. All it takes is one Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior per planet at any given time. Maybe per star system, I don't know. I suspect maybe per star system. Our descendants will find that out. In the Hosteen Kla lecture, I told about the time when the writer of a biography of Kla, a woman who she and her husband ran the oldest trading post on the Navajo Nation. And she was riding in a car with Hosteen Kla. And they were out, I think, in the northwestern part of the Navajo Reserve, out in that John Ford country of the huge plateaus and Monument Valley. And a tornado formed out of some thick black clouds and settled down, and actually settled exactly on the highway. In that part of the United States, there are very few roads. And for some reason or other, it came right down the highway. She stopped the car, and she was absolutely petrified because, well, which way should you run to get out? And she said that Kla just reached over and patted her. And then he got out of the car, and he went to the side of the road, and he picked some weeds that were there, some herbal plants, put them in his mouth, and he chewed on them, and he walked straight towards the tornado coming. And he chewed them, and she said that he paused about 100 yards from the car, and he spit at the tornado, and it split in two. And one part went up to the left, up, and the other part just whirled off into the desert on the side. Then he spit out what he had, and he came back to the car and got in and sat down. And she said while he was out there, it seemed that he was more real than nature. But by the time he got back and sat down in the car, he was just an old man again, hoping to sell some of his rugs that he made so he could get some food. That's what's real. That's what really happens. That when the tornado comes down the road and there's no other way out, then Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior gets busy, chews hell out of weeds, and takes care of the situation. It takes, though, a visionary capacity to be able to understand, to have a scorecard, to understand what game this is, what the teams are, who's scoring, who's ahead, the excitement of when the victory happens. Because if you don't know any of that, you miss it all. And having missed it all, it isn't real to you. The vision that forms first is to take time, incomprehensible similarities. And so vision is quite different from nature in that time is given portions or proportions. It isn't quite history yet. Later on, it'll become history. It'll have years, it'll have months, it'll have days. But in vision, time begins to have similarity, correspondent eras and qualities. And one of the divisions of time in vision from very, very ancient times, the first time that one runs across this in written language is in the pyramid text of Egypt about 5,000 years ago, or in the earliest Chinese character writings of about 5,000 years ago. One finds it at the origins of Chinese written civilization, the origins of Egyptian written civilization, which currently are the oldest records, written records on the planet. And one finds in both those traditions exactly a similar way of looking at time. That time has correspondent movements. It has sections that move, and these movements correspond with other sections and their movements. And we need to take a break, and we'll come back. Let's come back gently. Let's come back with Shakespeare. We're going to talk about Shakespeare for about a month. Let's talk about Shakespeare just for a minute. Let's look in a vision way at Shakespeare. Not many people these days take the time to appreciate Shakespeare. Appreciation of Shakespeare is sort of plummeted over the last couple of generations. I know he's more famous than ever and makes money on film versions, but people don't get it anymore. Shakespeare is one of the most powerful visionaries in the world. One of the curious things about Shakespeare is that in whatever language he's translated, he's powerful. For instance, one of the things that made Boris Pasternak a great poet was his translations of Shakespeare into Russian. And Shakespeare in Pasternak's Russian is Shakespeare. It's devastatingly great. When we come to something like The Tempest, which we're going to come to, you have to have a little bit of a visionary look at where this is. When Shakespeare was first writing plays, he was a young man, he was hardly 20 years old. He fell in with a bunch of good guys. He fell in with a bunch of actors, but actors who were tremendously learned, energetic, and they loved the kid that could just write. It was fantastic. And most of his early things are taken, they're redone versions of old stories. He would take a story from here, a story from there, and redo it, rewrite it, and then he would take the rewrite, and then he would Shakespeareanize it. Just like James Joyce, who wrote wonderful themes in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and then he redid it in Ulysses, in Stream of Consciousness, then he Joyceanized it in Finnegan's Wake. So that there are whole rooms in libraries now that are the sources of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, from the Icelandic, from the this and that. Shakespeare's like that. They're whole, not just rooms, but whole libraries. The Folger Library in Washington, D.C. on Shakespeare. So a whole huge building the size of the Parthenon, just books on Shakespeare. The one early play that is original with Shakespeare is Midsummer Night's Dream. And it shows Shakespeare understood fairy tales better than anyone has ever understood fairy tales. No one in world literature has ever understood fairy tales better than Shakespeare. And Midsummer Night's Dream is his original contribution. And he wrote it as a young man. He was about 21 years old. And he just put his loving heart into it. And when Shakespeare was old, and old doesn't sound very old to us, but in those days, under those conditions, and especially in terms of his life, it was towards the end of his life, Shakespeare redid A Midsummer Night's Dream in a visionary version called The Tempest. A deeper, wider, broader visionary version. So that if Midsummer Night's Dream is the archetypal fairy tale of Shakespeare, The Tempest is the cosmological epic of Shakespeare. It's the broadest version of what the seed is there in Midsummer Night's Dream. So if you get a chance, if you can't get the time to read it, you can see the old 1930s film version of Midsummer Night's Dream with Mickey Rooney as Puck and William Powell as I think Demetrius, and just watch that. It takes about 80 minutes to watch that. And Shakespeare puts himself in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He's the writer of the little comedy, the little skit, Pyramus and Thisbe. That's his self-portrait in there, Peter Quince. But the deep archetypal Shakespeare is the magician, the magus, in The Tempest. So when you come to read The Tempest, don't think of it as this cheap little paperback that you picked up for $1.50. Think of it as the greatest of all of the triumphal productions of the Renaissance, because that's what it is. It's the high watermark of Renaissance consciousness. It's the very pinnacle. It's the flag on top of the World Trade Center in Renaissance literature. Now, in order to understand this, in order to appreciate this, one has to go wider in vision than just visioning Shakespeare and seeing Midsummer Night's Dream and Tempest and seeing the quarter century that's in between them and the tremendous growth of the artist, one of the world's greatest of all writers. One has to have a larger vision. And in order to have this really large vision, I'm going to hearken to a transition. That is to say, I'm going to transition from Shakespeare, a vision of Shakespeare, to a vision of world history. And I'm going to use two other plays in the Shakespeare works, the Corpus Shakespeariana. Shakespearean. I have to keep this Latin. Lewis and Short would not approve. That's the authors of the great Latin English dictionary. The two plays that relate to Midsummer Night's Dream and Tempest in Shakespeare's history are Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. Julius Caesar was written when Shakespeare was, he was 35 years old. 35 years old. When a man gets to be about 35, he gets into this thing of wanting to see how good he is, so he tests himself. Sometimes subconsciously, if you don't know how to do things like that, you just challenge yourself. Find out how good you are. How much can you do? Julius Caesar is that kind of a play. Because after Julius Caesar, Shakespeare becomes disinterested in histories and comedies and becomes very interested in tragedies. It's only about 4 years later that he writes Hamlet. And right on its heels, right then, King Lear and Macbeth and Othello. So in a way, Julius Caesar is like the first indication of a tremendous deepening of maturity. And Julius Caesar is about, if you remember the lecture a couple of weeks ago and the lecture last week, Julius Caesar is the seed of the whole Roman Empire. He's the first time that a Latin-speaking Roman sizes himself up as a god. And that his inheritor, his chosen son, the Son of God, confirms that he was indeed a god. Then Octavian Caesar, the chosen son and inheritor of Julius Caesar, not only made it stick that Julius Caesar was divine, but that Octavian took the name Augustus and founded the Roman Empire on what is called the Augustan Principate. The Augustan Principate is very simple. You as administrators of Rome, as senators who run Rome, can make any decision that you want, but you have to ask me first. And however I vote, you have to consider that that's probably the wisest course for you to follow. So that Augustus called himself the first citizen. In the French Revolution, they always called each other citizens, and everybody was a little tremulous to be first citizen. Until Napoleon said, well, I'll be first citizen. Anywhere I want to go, I want to be first citizen. That Napoleon is a part of the Roman Empire disease. It's like that. So when Shakespeare writes Julius Caesar, he's writing about the seed of Roman power. In fact, the film version of Julius Caesar has a wonderful performance by the young Marlon Brando, who is absolutely captivating as the young Mark Antony. And when you see the intensity of the young Brando, you realize how great he was in that film, Julius Caesar, as Mark Antony. The older Shakespeare, the Shakespeare just about ready to write The Tempest, lets go of Julius Caesar. He doesn't write a deeper play which one would expect about Augustus Caesar. That's what one would expect, that he would write about Augustus Caesar. And he has Augustus Caesar on his mind because Shakespeare understood these things very well. He understood world power better than almost anybody now, much less in that age where people were thinking about power all the time. When you were living under the original Elizabeth, that's all you really thought about because you could lose your life by making a slip. She didn't sue you for libel. She had you rubbed out. And it didn't matter how favorite you were. Her favorite, Sir Walter Raleigh, ended up in the Tower of London and lost his head. He did a lot of things for her. Like what? He brought Virginia into the whole province of Virginia that used to go to the Mississippi River. He said, this is an English province of Her Highness. She still had him in prison because he mouthed off in the wrong way. So people like Shakespeare understood power in a really basic way. Stay alive. Stay alert. And so he didn't write about Augustus Caesar. If he had, he would have been killed. Because the connection between Elizabethan power, the Tudor lineage, and that kind of Caesar power that went from Julius Caesar to Augustus was the same thing, because Henry VIII is very much like a kind of a domestic Julius Caesar, and Elizabeth was very much like a domestic Augustus. Henry VIII said, "The British Isle belongs to me, and I want to be head of the English church as well as king," and continental powers can just, you know all the phrases. Whereas Elizabeth said, "England is not enough for me, I want the entire world. I want British ships to go everywhere, and anywhere that they put into port, I want that to be part of my realm." And the theme will be "Rule Britannia." And the next phrase in that song is "Britannia, rule the waves," which means the oceans of the world are British highways. And you say to yourself, well, yeah, but weren't there other people who were offering competition? Yeah, the biggest competition was Spain. But after 1588, after the Spanish Armada gathered all the ships they could make, beg, or borrow, and they lost a tremendous naval battle to England, 1588. And after that, British sea power inevitably grew in such a way that it literally ruled the world until the Second World War. The sun never set on the British Empire. That was the phrase at the beginning of this century, and they meant it. Edwardian England had absolutely no doubt. They're direct line inheritors of Elizabethan power. One of the great speakers for English power at the turn of the century said of the English, of the Victorian Edwardian English, he said, "We are no longer subject to the vicissitudes of evolution because we have crawled ashore from that mess. We have arrived. We are secure forever." All of that began in Shakespeare's time. All of that began with Elizabeth. So he didn't write about Augustus Caesar in his maturity, but he wrote about Augustus Caesar from an angle, right? You take a discrete angle. And so the play that he wrote was about the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the hands of Augustus. It talks about Augustus Caesar's sized domination and power, but from a complementary standpoint, diplomatically, because you're writing a play about the people who lost to it. And indirectly, inadvertently, you're saying if people of this caliber and depth and understanding of power, if they lost, who was it that beat them? Must be really fantastic. And so he let implication handle. And so Antony and Cleopatra is about two of the most powerful people of the age. But when you see Antony and Cleopatra done, it's very rarely done because it is very difficult to perform. It's difficult because there's a titanic, humorous irony that deepens into the edge of tragedy, but never quite gets there. When Antony and Cleopatra is done right, Shakespeare's genius shows a kind of a movement of enormous superiority of the audience because they can see that these tremendously powerful people are locked into a situation where their own flaws flay their ambitions and their capacities, and they lose. It's almost like watching a slow PBS gladiatorial show like an I, Claudius or something, and the audience becomes convinced that they're really in a superior position because look at these powerful people, how pitifully they try to get out of a situation they cannot. There's a kind of an ironical, not quite sarcastic, not biting, but a very deep kind of humor that almost sours into enormous tragedy, but not quite. Very great writing, incredible writing. Nuances that most people never even guess exist, presented artistically to an ace perfection. Those events happened 2,000 years ago. And in a way, when one takes a 2,000-year cycle, you come to a very interesting understanding of civilization. When you look at history in terms of 2,000-year periods, let's try something from the beginning. If we're looking at a 2,000-year period, we want to look at the middle of a 2,000-year period. So that in the middle of a 2,000-year period, the very middle will have 1,000 years on either side. That is to say, it'll be a time form, a form of time that has a middle, and the middle is in the center and has two millennial aspects on either side of it. So that one half will be like a radius, that the time form will have a radius of a millennium. So that actually this time form is constructed not of a 2,000-year diameter so much, but of a 1,000-year radius. And a 1,000-year period is a millennium, so that this is a millennial time form. The ancient Greek word for this time form was aion, ion, or sometimes mispronounced in English since the 17th century, pronounced eon, and thus spelled E-O-N. Sometimes before the mispronunciation, it used to be spelled I-O-N. Or sometimes because they Latinized the Greek A-E-O-N, but the Greek is A-I-O-N. It is a Hellenistic Greek high philosophy time form. And its shape is controlled by the ecology, by the movement, by the revolution of a millennium. So that one can determine the properties of any given time form by the functions of a millennium within that time form. It's like the radius of a circle. Once you know the radius of a circle, and you know universal abstract properties of a circle, like pi r square or whatever it is to get the area of it, you can take a millennial archetype in a given time form, and you can literally read out from the trigonometric meaning of that exactly what that time form is all about. And you can predict, I'm saying mathematically precise, you can predict exactly where the sequences are going to be, what the divisions are going to be. And once you've seen several aeons like that as cases, and you know how to work the mathematics, you can look at the beginnings of a millennium, and you can tell, because of the character of the beginning, we know this from chaos theory, for instance, if you know precisely the beginning point, even if there's a random motion, you can characterize exactly what's going to turn out from that. Now, you don't have to go and buy some old leather-bound copy of Nostradamus, which is guessing at the best. But one can take a look and see how a millennium begins, has the character of how it works itself out. So it's like in the film version of Dune, where the Princess Irulan says that the beginning is the most delicate of all things. One needs to take a lot of care of how something begins. And this is true. Now that 2,000-year time form that we were in for a long time and are not in anymore, the middle of that, just to give it a broad sense, would be 1,000 years ago, which would be 1000 AD. Now if you look at the Western world around 1000 AD, it's pretty grim. It's back in the icebox, back in the Dark Ages. Something called the Carolingian Renaissance happened around Charlemagne's time, around 800, and things looked good for about 3 generations, and then it all quieted down. But there is a conspicuous figure about 1000 AD, and that figure is a man named Anselm. And Anselm is the first of the great scholastic philosophers. He's the first of the learned monastic logicians. He's the first time that monks started to talk and think about logic and not about mysticism. Before Anselm, monks are always farmers who have retreated from the world, who pray all the time and who don't think about anything except keep on the good graces of that kind of heart energy of clinging to the Virgin Mother archetype, the good earth. Monks after Anselm are completely different. They're thinking all the time about the structures of their mind, about whether it's logical, whether it's rational, whether it works out, and to make sure that the world is taken care of in a rational way by the mind of monastic monks like themselves. And so Anselm comes at the middle of the aeon that we were in for 2,000 years. And he's a watershed. Before him, you have farmer monks, and after him, you have logically scholastic monks. The farmers want to grow enough food to care for their meals. The logical scholastic monks want to control the education of the whole world one way or another, to ensure that it will be rational and that it will be ours. So that Anselm is a very interesting figure. Now let's remember the date 1000 AD because it'll come up again in just a little bit. All right, let's set that aside. Let's set that aside and let's open up our minds. Let's make a new blackboard. Or I guess this is the computer age. Let's have a new monitor. Nothing on the screen. We want to take a 2,000-year period, but we want to start not from where we are going back, but we want to start someplace back there and come forward. Let's take the origins of writing. Now, the first time that any comprehensive writing occurs, and we mentioned this morning, 2 places, China and Egypt, both about 5,000 years ago. So about 3000 BC, in both Egypt and China, you find for the first time written text material that is pretty comprehensive. In China, it centers around a figure later on called mythological, but the figure is probably very historical, named Fu Shi, F-U-H-S-I. That's before Chinese went into the pinyin spelling system. I don't know how they spell it now. Fu Shi. Probably F-U-X-I or something like that. So Fu Shi, who is the original writer of what becomes the I Ching. Fu Shi's written characters are all about what is called the older version of the I Ching, or the celestial, the heavenly version. It uses the patterns of heaven. And in Fu Shi's time, 3000 BC, this was completely new, completely radical. Because before then, the Chinese, like most people, took their cues from the landscape. To take your cues of the structure of how the vision works from the heavens means that you have to have a lot of experience with observation of stars and putting stars together as constellations. And it takes a very long time. It takes many tens of thousands of years. to be able to build up a capacity to vision heaven, that the heavens have patterns. For instance, it's very difficult even today for someone who doesn't have an astronomical background. If you wake up early tomorrow morning and there are no clouds in the sky just before sunrise, you can notice that there are 3 bright stars that are fairly close together, 2 of them very close together and 1 not very far away. And those bright stars will be there even when all the rest of the stars go out because of the rising sun, because they're planets. And the brightest one lower down is Venus, and the really bright one, not quite as bright as Venus, but very bright up above, is Jupiter, and the cinnamon red one near it is Mars. And because there's a full moon in the sky, and the moon is still up, and because of the nature of the equinoctial approach right now, you can get the sunrise and intuit that there's a sun. You can see by Gestalt intuition, there's the sun, there's the earth, there's moon, there's Venus, there's Jupiter, and there's Mars. So that you have 6 celestial bodies out of the solar system, and you can almost begin to envision the whole of our star system. Enough of the gestalt of the star system. And in fact, Mercury is so close to the sun usually that it's only about this time of year that if you're in a spot where you can see just before sunrise, you will see a bright star that stays there. That's Mercury. So that you have everything from the sun all the way out to the orbit of Jupiter. That's an enormous chunk of our star system. You can see it in the sky at the same time, in one angle field of vision. And you can almost imagine a rare occurrence that all this belongs to one system. The first time that the Chinese got that was about 3000 BC, and the I Ching is about the changes of the universe based upon understanding the movements of that intuitive gestalt. So Fuxi is quite an enormous achievement 5,000 years ago. In Egypt, the changes happen in a transition not just from the land, but to another realm of the land. Not so much into the heavens, although the constellation that was dominant at the time was Orion. And the relationship of the star Sirius to Orion was always the archetypal celestial version of the resurrection religion of archaic Egypt, of early dynastic Egypt. From Abydos on the vernal equinox, the relationship of the star Sirius to the constellation Orion was a clear indication of the Nile and its flooding. It was always a clear indication. When you could see that combination in the sky, you knew that the cycle was ready for an infusion of energy. The Egyptians, in their pyramid texts, made an inner motion of a transcendental realm. Its early name is pronounced Rosatu, actually. Rosatu. It means that heavenly realm that we go to after we have lived this life. This is the afterlife. We're there. And that whole quality is there, already complete in the earliest pyramid texts in Egypt 5,000 years ago. It's not kindergarten sketches. It's not something like an early theology or theological form that's going to develop. It's already fully developed. It's already an ancient wisdom. It's just written down for the first time. And it's written on the insides of the pyramids. They call them pyramid texts because they're not written on the pyramids on the outside, but they're written on the insides of the pyramid. The text begins as soon as you enter the pyramid and extends along usually an entrance corridor, and usually has a bifurcation in where there's a chamber on one side and then there's a sarcophagus chamber on another. That's usually how it is. And those words are written on the inside because they are only to be read by the spirit, by the Ka, of he whose pyramid that is. This is sacred writing, hence it's called hieroglyphics. Hieros means sacred. Hieros gamos, sacred marriage. Hieroglyphics, sacred glyphs, sacred language, meant only for the spiritual eyes of that person for whom this pyramid is made. The pyramid of Unas was for Unas. The pyramid of Cheops was for Cheops. Kepharin's pyramid is only for Kepharin. No one else. Now, 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC, this is the way in which written language first surfaced on this planet, Egypt and China. Now, if we take that as a line, we would like to know 3000 BC, let's take a 2,000-year period, that goes from 3000 BC to 1000 BC. So we would like to know, well, what happens 1000 BC? Is there any kind of development that happens in those civilizations? Yes, there is. In China, around 1000 BC, is the first radical revision of the I Ching since Fuxi's days. It's the beginning, in fact, of a whole new dynasty, of a whole new kind of dynasty, the Zhou, C-H-O-U, as I used to spell it, pronounced Zhou. The Zhou dynasty. And the book that we get today, the I Ching that we have today, that you buy in the bookstores, its correct name is the Book of Zhou. That it belongs to the Zhou, founders of the Zhou dynasty. Two men, King Wen and his close relation who is always known as the Duke of Zhou. And they're the ones who revised the I Ching. Instead of the I Ching being reflective of the heavenly cycle of Fuxi, it's reflected of the human cycle of King Wen and the Duke of Zhou. The I Ching is meant to reflect a human value rather than a celestial value as its referent. What happens in Egypt about 1000 BC is a little difficult to tell because Egypt has suffered the kinds of incursions that China didn't suffer. And one has to look at a wider vision of Egypt and realize that Egypt had spread in the meantime to a lot of places, had a lot of cognates, and that the figure who summarizes the Egyptian wisdom tradition 1000 BC is King Solomon. King Solomon in Jerusalem is the culmination and the beginning of a whole new aeon of wisdom in that Western tradition. He is a revision of the pyramid text, just like King Wen and the Duke of Zhou are a revision of Fuxi. Now, there's a very interesting way to check these kinds of things out. Any given aeon, any given time form like that, because it's controlled by a radius, by a millennial radius, its whole structure is all a function of the geometry and the meaning a function of the trigonometry. Structure is geometric, meaning is trigonometric. Understanding of it is higher math. You have to go higher than, well, what's higher than that? Kind of like calculus. When you understand the calculus of time forms, you can say a lot. Just as a millennial radius determines the whole structure and thus the meaning function of a time form, you can take an aeon as a radius of a double aeon. One aeon as the radius of a double aeon, a 4,000-year period. And the same kind of math holds, the same kind of understanding holds. So that, for instance, let's take the West. Let's take from the pyramid text to King Solomon, the 2,000-year period. Solomon's about 1000 BC. If we look 2,000 years after Solomon, we come from 1000 BC to 1000 AD. We come to Anselm. It's very interesting that King Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, is midway between the logic, monk, scholastic of the mind taking over the world in these scholastic, logic, monkish terms, and the pyramid texts made for the after-death mind, spirit of the maker of the pyramids. So somehow, the pyramids of Egypt and the logical monastic monks of the scholastic Middle Ages are related together, and that relationship is balanced exactly with King Solomon. Very precise, as a matter of fact. It's mathematically very close. What about China? Okay, from Fuxi 3000 BC to King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, that's 1000 BC. We'll just call that the I Ching, the Book of Zhou, the Book of Changes, the I Ching as we have it, from the originator of the I Ching to the I Ching itself as we have it today. 2,000 years after that would be 1000 AD again. Well, what's happening in China? One of the greatest of all Chinese philosophers lives about 1000 AD. His name is Chu Shi, C-H-U-H-S-I. So on both sides of the I Ching, you have a Fu Shi and a Chu Shi. F-U-S-H-I. You thought something else for a minute. And C-H-U-H-S-I. So there's just almost the same kind of word, almost the same kind of name, Fu Shi and Chu Shi. And the I Ching is exactly in the center of that, balancing 2,000 years on both sides. What's Chu Shi about? Chu Shi is about a radical revision of Chinese thought, so radical that it holds even today. He is the reformulator of what was called at the time Neo-Confucianism. Before then, there was no such thing as a Neo-Confucianism. After Chu Shi, there's no such thing as Confucianism. There's only variants of Neo-Confucianism. Mao Zedong was a Neo-Confucianist version. And that's why for a long time they banned people who were Confucian scholars because they didn't want any competition. Feng Yulan, the 90-year-old author of the History of Chinese Philosophy in 2 volumes that Princeton published in English translation by Dirk Bode in the 30s, was completely banned. He could not speak in public. In fact, the only times he spoke in public was to recant Confucius. They dragged him out every time. Was Confucius wrong? Yes. Was he bad? Yes. Good. Go back home. Why? Because he was competition. Direct competition. How can Confucius be direct competition? It isn't that Confucius so much as direct competition, but that understanding Confucius and what he meant is a Neo-Confucian prize. And we're the only guys who understand. Nobody else can. You get it? So that Chu Shi and Anselm represent 1,000 years ago, 1 millennium ago. Very interesting cross-checks on the way in which the time forms effects on human minds are structured. Logical, scholastic monks who are not interested in farming so much, but in keeping rational form in the world by their authority. The authority of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, does not come from liberation theologists in South America. It comes from a scholastic tradition of precise doctrinal accuracy, which is infallible, which is a hallmark of Anselm. That's what all that is about. Perfect thought forms that are logically eternal because they are right. And Chu Shi's Neo-Confucianism is a very delicate balance of a revision of Chinese civilization that works very, very well only when a certain kind of power group is in command. And when that power group is not in command, the world's not going to work right. Now, when Chu Shi wrote, the Sung dynasty was in full force. It was the great apex of Chinese civilization in terms of its power. It's like Trajan's Rome. Sung China went from Siberia to Indonesia and all the way west to the Caspian Sea. Sung China was enormous. It was the biggest that China would ever be. And Chu Shi's philosophy was the linchpin that made it so. Now, when the Mongols came in, when the Sung dynasty fell, and a new dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, came in, the Mongols came in, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, they were not Chinese. They didn't understand that you had have this Neo-Confucian scholastic rationale to keep this thing. The Mongols thought that the sword and the horse were enough to keep everybody in line by terror. And this is not so. When the Yuan dynasty fell, when the Mongols fell, and China regained itself, the next dynasty, the Ming. Ming in Chinese, when it's pronounced Ming, means name, means the power of the name, but when it's pronounced Ming, it means bright. So in a way, just by saying Ming with the right ambience means bright name, it means that the Neo-Confucian power came back. And one of the greatest of all Chinese philosophers, Wang Yang Ming, comes in the Ming dynasty and founds its philosophy, and it brings Neo-Confucianism into such a powerful place that all great Chinese thinkers for the last 500 years have been variants, not only of Chu Shi, but even closer, variants of Wang Yang Ming. In the last 500 years, you will find no Chinese who understands Lao Tzu, and no Chinese that understands Confucius except to quote him and to study for the exams. Understand? Confucius and Lao Tzu are like children's books, but the real adult power games that control the world are controlled by Neo-Confucianism as honed and modified by Wang Yang Ming. Now, if you don't understand that, you don't get China at all. Time has run out, so I'll give you a little apocryphal story. I once hosted in Canada 40 Red Chinese engineers. This was in the early 1970s, and the United States and China had no relationships at all, but Canada did. And they came to Calgary, Alberta, because they were petroleum engineers. And they wanted to come to learn about extraction of techniques, Alberta tar sands. And my close friend was the head of the consortium of all the oil companies doing the research that made the extraction of tar sands petroleum possible. He was a Turk originally, but a Canadian citizen. Excellent man. used to tell me Mullah Nasruddin stories in the middle of parties. I dropped a drink one time. It was so funny. He's a great guy. He's a character. So here this bus, this travel bus, pulls up in front of his palatial home, the top of Mount Royal in Calgary, the biggest home in the city. And out come 40 engineers, all in black Mao suits with a red star on the collar, shaved back, gray, butch haircuts. And I had laid out a series of books because I was experimenting, right? I was an educator. I had the Tao Te Ching in Chinese and French and English. I had the I Ching. I had all these things. They came in. They were not interested at all. None of them were interested in any of these books. The only set of books they were interested in was a biographical dictionary of Republican China in 2 volumes, because they wanted to look up and see what had happened to so-and-so, because nobody knew anything, because they were never told. And like a fool, because I was only, 30 years old, I presented a copy to the delegation, a man named Tong Kei. I asked him at about 10 million. He smoked a cigar with 2 fingers like this, and when he puffed like this, all the other ones shut up. They just, whatever they were saying, they were watching him out of the corner of his eyes. And when I presented him with this I Ching, and I said, I understand this is one of the great books of your civilization, when he heard the interpretation, the translator, he got beet red in the face, like he was angry, put his cigar, and then without puffing, he just lowered it down, just looked at me steely. Yeah. Right? It's not on tape, right? An American shit telling him about his civilization. Well, I could have told him a lot about his civilization. So when he said that, and I caught that, I said to the translator that I couldn't find a suitable edition of Wang Yang Ming to present to him. And when that came through, he butted out his cigar and he looked away as if he was satisfied with my apology, because he knew what I was talking about. Yeah. Less on this next week and more on the class.